There's a debate, you can call it that. They did debate it in Congress about whether or not this was going to really be anti-inflationary or in some ways deflationary for overall prices and the economy. We have seen a recent precedent of massive amounts of government spending. It happened during the virus pandemic between 2020 and 2021-22. And you could argue that drove prices higher between the Fed and taxpayer spending. So what is your thought here? Is this going to lower inflation?
Well, I think what's interesting, let's take the bill which is supposed to lower inflation, which is the Inflation Reduction Act. Over 10 years, the amount of sort of fiscal tightening is super modest. The impact on drug prices, that stuff doesn't even begin till like 2026. So if inflation begins to fall, it's anytime soon over the next months, it's not going to be because of this bill. Now, a lot of voters might say, wow, they just passed this inflation reduction bill and now inflation's falling. I guess the two are related. I mean, I'm sure the Biden administration would like them to think that, and they very well may think that. But to be honest, if that bill is really a climate spending bill, just like the CHIPS bill you mentioned earlier, that's really a R&D bill. Well, those aren't the bits that we're talking the most about.
Jimmy, a lot of business school classes, a lot of kind of general economics classes in college and whatnot, we'll talk about this idea of life cycle costs, right? Investing now, you spend more upfront so that you spend less going forward in the future. Is there a case to be made that when it comes to things like the Inflation Reduction Act, that by spending the kind of money you do right now on things like renewable energy projects, on things like healthcare, that you make the investment, so to speak, now so that you don't have to pay as much down the line?
Listen, fighting inflation, that is a monetary policy role. And I think the case that you're making, and I think that's also the case that the Biden administration is making, and certainly lots of economists, is that these bills, plus the infrastructure bill, will increase the productive capacity of the economy. And that is anti-inflationary. Because, what's inflation? It's, too much money chasing too goods. But if you can suddenly produce more goods and produce them more efficiently, then overall, over the long term, you've created a more inflation-resilient economy. And listen, particularly with the infrastructure bill and the R&D and some of these other things, I mean, that's a legitimate case.
Now, if you take a look, though, at the way things have shaken out over the last couple of years, we've seen taxpayer money spent in a very direct way at trying to boost the American economy. It literally became checks being sent out, so to speak, right, or money showing up in people's account. If that taxpayer money was spent in the way that it was, and you could argue that it led to some of the inflation that we're seeing right now, could we be ready to see more of that kind of inflation given the massive amounts of money being earmarked for spending again in this kind of environment?
Well, I mean, I just think there's a really degree difference between the kind of spending that we saw with the American Rescue Plan, which, I think you can find a lot of economists who agree that that certainly caused a few points of the current inflation spike. Like if that money had been spent more in R&D, maybe not spent at all, maybe spent on reducing deficits, we would certainly be in a better position today. And I think going forward, we really want to think a lot more about how we can make this economy more productive. And remember, who's going to be doing the R&D? Who's going to be working in those chip factories? It's going to be a lot of talented immigrants. So we better focus a lot more on getting them over here, or the productive aspects of these bills aren't going to work so well.
And Jimmy, before we let you go here, we talked about right now, just before you came on, the developing news overnight with President Trump, his house being raided down in Mar-a-Lago. Can you take us through whether or not you think this kind of changes the Republican narrative going into the midterms, and whether or not this does provide or take away from the fuel that Donald Trump has to make another run at the presidency?
Well, I can tell you right now in D.C., no one's talking about green tax credits. They're talking about this, this FBI investigation. let me say this, is that there's still a piece of this inflation bill that still needs to be done, and that's sort of a permitting bill to kind of ease up on some of these environmental regulations, so we can build a lot more infrastructure, clean energy. That's going to require Republican help, and one concern is that Republicans are not going to be willing to help with that bill because this FBI raid is going to consume Washington. And to the extent it gets Republicans who are already pretty juiced up about this election to come out more, I think it really throws the midterms, up for grabs a little bit. I'll also add that Ron DeSantis has moved ahead of Trump on the betting markets for 2024. So I think the political ramifications really, really early, but it's very volatile.